Sacred Heart Hospital's emergency department hums at 2 in the morning like a machine that never quite sleeps. Fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes time feel suspended, irrelevant. Hannah Clarke moves through the unit with a kind of efficiency that comes from having once coordinated trauma responses in a Humvee outside Tikrit, though no one here knows that. 3 months into her nursing position at Sacred Heart, she has perfected the art of invisibility. Her locker contains 3 sets of scrubs, a pair of backup shoes, and nothing else. No photographs. No personal items. No past. She arrives for the night shift at 10:27 p.m., 17 minutes early, because showing up early looks committed and committed people don't get asked questions. The parking garage smells like damp concrete and engine oil. Her car, a 2009 Honda Civic, anonymous and forgettable, parks in the back row where nobody notices. The walk to the employee entrance takes exactly 4 minutes. She times it on purpose. For minutes means she avoids the shift change crowds. For minutes means fewer people to nod at, to make small talk with, to potentially remember her face tomorrow. The locker room is empty when she arrives. She changes methodically, regular clothes off, scrubs on, hair pulled back with the same precision she once used securing a tourniquet in a casualty situation. The face looking back at her in the mirror is unfamiliar. That's intentional. Hannah Clarke, night shift nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, Oregon, bears no resemblance to the woman who spent 15 years as Senior Chief Petty Officer with the 75th Ranger Regiment. That woman doesn't exist anymore. That woman heard helicopter sounds and felt incoming fire. That woman couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol on her nightstand. That woman couldn't be in a hospital with white walls and fluorescent lights without her hands trembling. So Hannah became someone else. Someone quieter. Someone nobody notices. The supply closet is her sanctuary. At 11:15 p.m., before the night shift officially begins, she organizes the emergency equipment with the same methodical precision she once used maintaining medical kits in field conditions. Tourniquets sorted by size. For kits aligned perfectly. Pressure dressings stacked in descending order. 14-gauge angiocath needles in their designated tray, color-coded by gauge size. The work is repetitive and grounding. Her hands move with absolute certainty, scarred forearms visible when she rolls her sleeves up, though she usually keeps them covered. Faded tan lines mark her left wrist where her military ring once sat before she removed it. Before she became Hannah Clarke, just a nurse. Nobody important. Nobody with a past. The scars tell stories to anyone who bothers to look. One runs from her wrist to her elbow, pale and thin, from a shrapnel wound sustained during the second Tikrit deployment. Another, thicker and more pronounced, crosses her palm where she gripped a broken window frame while extracting a wounded squad member under fire. But the night shift nurses work with their eyes down. Nobody asks about scars. Nobody asks about anything. That's what Hannah has come to understand about invisibility. It thrives when people are too tired and too busy to ask questions. At 11:16 p.m., the first ambulance call comes through. 53-year-old male, myocardial infarction, ETA 6 minutes. Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrives in the trauma bay at 11:54 p.m., 3 minutes before the patient, which gives him time to review the incoming vitals while maintaining the appearance of preparedness. He's the type of doctor who cares deeply about appearances. Designer watch. Custom-tailored white coat. The kind of composure that comes from knowing your family's name carries weight in Portland's medical circles. Hannah has the 12-lead EKG ready before anyone asks for it. She has the crash cart positioned. She has oxygen running at the appropriate flow rate. She moves with the invisible efficiency of someone who has orchestrated actual life-and-death situations, not simulations. Dr. Hargrove notices. His eyes narrow slightly. Competence is threatening when it comes from someone he's classified as insignificant. The patient's name is Robert Chen, 53, electrician, married, 2 kids in college. He arrives conscious but in obvious distress, chest pain radiating down his left arm, diaphoretic despite the cool Portland night air. Hannah establishes 2 lines while Dr. Hargrove positions himself at the patient's head, performing the usual rituals of authority, speaking louder than necessary, issuing orders that don't require repetition. She doesn't watch him. She watches the monitor. She watches the numbers. She watches the way Robert Chen's pupils dilate in pain and fear. She's seen this before. In a different country, under different circumstances, on soldiers whose names she still remembers. Get a troponin level, Dr. Hargrove commands. And I want a chest X-ray, stat. Hannah is already moving toward the lab station. She's already flagged the blood work. She knows what comes next because she's been trained by people who couldn't afford mistakes. Mistakes in field medicine meant body bags. Mistakes here mean lawsuits, but the urgency still registers in her nervous system the same way. The needle goes in smooth. The blood fills the tube. The tube goes into the pneumatic system with a soft whoosh. 30 seconds. That's all it took. Smooth. Efficient. Invisible. Dr. Hargrove watches her work and his jaw tightens just slightly. He doesn't like nurses who don't need instruction. The cardiac cath lab calls down requesting the patient in 17 minutes. The plan is to run an urgent coronary angiogram, identify the blockage, place a stent if possible. Standard protocol for acute MI. Routine. Except there's nothing routine about Robert Chen's situation. Hannah reads the EKG patterns like a language she's fluent in, the ST elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF tells her the inferior wall is being starved of oxygen. The posterior involvement in the right coronary territory tells her this is serious. This is the kind of situation where minutes matter. At 12:23 a.m., while Dr. Hargrove steps away to take a phone call, Hannah notices something. His billing tablet sits on the counter beside the sink, still active, still displaying patient records. The screen shows 3 procedures billed to Robert Chen's insurance, 2 stress tests and 1 echocardiogram. Hannah knows these procedures weren't performed. She was here for Robert's intake. She reviewed his chart. There's no record of any testing before the acute MI occurred. No stress tests. No echocardiogram. Just the man's initial complaint of chest pain and the subsequent ambulance call when it became critical. Her eyes meet the data for approximately 3 seconds. That's all the time it takes to understand what she's seeing. That's all the time it takes to become dangerous to someone like Dr. Hargrove. He returns to the trauma bay at 12:26 a.m. and immediately retrieves his tablet, glancing at Hannah's face for any sign that she's seen something she shouldn't have. She's already turned away, already focused entirely on Robert Chen's full line, already become invisible again. But they both know something has shifted. It's the kind of small moment that changes trajectories. The kind of moment that puts a spotlight on an inconvenient competence. Robert Chen is transported to the cath lab at 12:41 a.m. He survives the procedure. The stent is placed successfully. The right coronary artery is opened. By 3:15 a.m., his troponin levels indicate moderate myocardial damage but not the catastrophic injury that would have killed him if the intervention had come any later. He'll go home in a week. He'll return to his family. He'll live. What he won't know is that Dr. Hargrove has already begun calculating how to eliminate a variable. A competent night shift nurse who keeps her head down and her locker bare represents a serious liability. Competence, combined with attention to detail, combined with access to his billing records, makes Hannah Clarke into the kind of problem that requires a solution. Hannah doesn't notice his calculation. She's in the locker room at 6:33 a.m., when her shift ends, sitting on the bench in front of her otherwise empty locker. Her reflection in the small mirror taped to the inside of the door shows the face she's created, neutral expression, eyes that have learned not to see too much, lips that have learned not to speak. She reaches up and touches her forearm, finding the scar beneath her sleeve, the ridge of tissue that remembers Tikrit. The scar remembers incoming fire. The scar remembers holding someone else's life in her hands. The scar remembers the woman she used to be. She whispers it to herself like a prayer or a warning, "You're nobody here." That's the point. The fluorescent lights in the locker room buzz their electric hum. Outside, Portland's morning begins. Traffic sounds increase. The city wakes. And Hannah Clarke, the woman who was once a senior chief petty officer, closes her locker and walks out into daylight where nobody knows her name or her past or what she's capable of when lives are on the line. She doesn't know that Dr. Hargrove has already made his first phone calls. She doesn't know that a decision has been made to dismantle her carefully constructed invisibility. She doesn't know that what's about to happen over the next 72 hours will require her to become something other than invisible. But the scars on her forearms know. They remember what happens when staying quiet is no longer an option. The scars on her forearms know what staying silent costs. They remember Tikrit, the weight of tourniquets, the spray of copperpenny blood in a Humvee that smelled like diesel and fear. But the scars also remember something else, the price of being seen. And in 3 months at Sacred Heart in Portland, Hannah Clarke had paid in meticulous silence to remain invisible. That silence was about to shatter. The morning shift change gathered at the nurses' station like they always did, coffee steaming from chipped mugs, charts stacked in trays, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical hymn. Dr. Hargrove stood at the center of them, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry down the hallway, designed for an audience. He held a clipboard with a sly smile that made his jaw jut forward like he was already winning something. "I'm starting a pool," he announced, scanning the faces of the residents and nurses. His presence had that quality of a man who'd learned young that confidence was its own currency, smooth, practiced, the confidence of someone whose father knew judges. "How long before our little Hannah quits?" Hannah stood 3 feet away, reviewing patient charts for her incoming shift. Her hands didn't pause. Her breathing didn't change. But she heard it the way a fawn hears the snap of a branch. "I give her a week," Hargrove continued, his voice dropping to that tone doctors use when they're trying to sound casual but mean something surgical. "Maybe 2 if she toughs it out. She's got that look, you know? Like she can't handle the pressure. Like she's waiting for permission to leave." Laughter rippled through the station, not mean laughter, just the reflexive noise of people caught between wanting to fit in and wanting to stay invisible themselves. One of the residents forced a smile. A nurse with 15 years and tired eyes looked at her shoes. Hannah's jaw tightened. One single breath in. One single breath out. When she finally spoke, her voice came out the way a blade slides from a sheath, smooth, inevitable, the sound of something sharp. "I've survived worse than you, doctor." The words hung in the air like a challenge she hadn't meant to issue. Hargrove's smirk widened. He didn't know what he was looking at. He saw a woman in navy scrubs with dark hair pulled back tight and competent hands. He saw someone temporary, someone who would crack under pressure because people like that always did. He had no idea that the woman standing 3 feet from him had spent 18 months learning to tie off bleeding arteries in the back of a moving military vehicle while the sound of gunfire turned her hearing into white noise. He had no idea that pain was just information, and she knew how to read it. "We'll see about that, sweetheart," Hargrove said, and the word was designed to diminish her, to fit her into a shape smaller than she actually was. He turned back to his audience, already moving on, already certain he'd won the exchange. Hannah turned back to her charts. Her hands were steady. Only her jaw moved, a single clench, and then it was over. But it wasn't over. Not even close. 3 days later, the cafeteria was crowded with the afternoon shift on break, the space loud with the clatter of silverware and the overlapping voices of people who'd been on their feet for 8 hours. Hannah carried her lunch tray through the flow of bodies, a sandwich, apple slices, a bottle of water, nothing that required much attention. She was walking with purpose, the way trained people walk, minimizing wasted movement. Dr. Hargrove entered from the far end, moving against the crowd. Their collision was perfectly timed. Perfectly angled. His shoulder caught her tray at exactly the right moment, the kind of accident that required actual coordination to pull off. The tray flipped. Food scattered across the cafeteria tiles like an explosion in slow motion. Her sandwich slid across 6 feet of floor. The apple slices spun in an arc. The bottle of water skittered under a nearby table, and for a moment, the entire cafeteria went quiet. The room went dead silent. Hannah knelt without hesitation, without embarrassment, without the kind of fury that would have been justified. She gathered the pieces methodically, her movements carrying the precision of someone who'd learned efficiency under pressure. Around her, people tried not to stare. Hargrove watched from where he stood, a study in manufactured innocence. "Careful, Hannah," he said, his voice carrying that same practiced casualness. "You're making a mess of everything around here." She looked up at him without breaking eye contact. And there it was, one tear, escaping down her cheek with the inevitability of a single drop of water finding its path downward. She wiped it away with the back of her hand before it could fall further, her jaw tight, her breathing controlled. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that only he heard it. "The only mess here is the one you're hiding, Doctor." His face hardened. Something shifted in his expression, from casual cruelty to something colder. Understanding flickered behind his eyes. She knew. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. She'd seen something she shouldn't have, and now she was warning him. His hand clenched at his side, and for a moment, his mask slipped just enough to show the calculation underneath. He was already reaching for his phone. Evening rounds came with its own rhythm of exhaustion and routine. Dr. Hargrove moved through the ward with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark, taking notes, absorbing his opinions as though they were doctrine. He carried patient charts in a stack against his chest, and his jaw worked the way it did when he was angry but pretending he wasn't. When he reached Hannah's station, he didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he reviewed a chart from his stack, made a note in his sharp, angular handwriting, and then looked directly at Hannah with eyes like black ice. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, and he threw the chart at her feet with the kind of casual violence that only works when you have institutional authority protecting you. Paper scattered across the floor in a chaos of white rectangles, each one carrying the name and vulnerability of the patient whose life they documented. The resident stared at their shoes. The patient in the nearby bed went very still. Hannah bent slowly. She gathered each page with deliberate care, her hand steady despite the way her heart had shifted into a different rhythm. Not panic. Not rage. Something closer to a switch being flipped. She stood, holding the reassembled chart, her eyes meeting his with the kind of contact that was almost aggressive in its steadiness. "My name is Hannah Clarke," she said quietly. "And I know exactly what you're doing." The threat hung in the air between them like something sharp enough to draw blood. Hargrove's face flushed a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was probably approaching dangerous territory. He took the chart from her hands with enough force that it was almost wrenching. "That's quite enough," one of the residents said weakly, but nobody moved. The moment had weight. The moment had consequence. Then the alarm came. Not from Hargrove's direction. From the emergency bay. An ambulance had just arrived, sirens cutting off abruptly as the back doors swung open. The radio crackled, male, 50s, found unresponsive downtown, vitals crashing, ETA 2 minutes. The moment dissolved. Hannah moved with the organized chaos that comes when a trauma patient hits the floor, sliding into the role that actually mattered, the one where she disappeared into function. Doctors scattered toward the trauma bay. Residents ran to position themselves. Hannah grabbed a pair of gloves and moved toward the incoming stretcher. The unconscious man arrived with EMTs performing chest compressions, calling out vitals in that rapid-fire medical shorthand that becomes its own language. Male, approximately 55, found unresponsive in a park near the Burnside Bridge, dropped pulse, no identification, no wallet, nothing but the clothes on his body and a single piece of jewelry that caught Hannah's attention immediately. A military ring. Worn gold with an emblem she recognized the way soldiers recognize each other in crowds, something that carries the weight of 1,000 hours of training. She took initial assessment, her hands moving with automatic precision. His jacket was expensive but worn, the kind of thing someone buys once and keeps for decades. As they transferred him to the bay, as the monitors began their electronic song of his failing body, she noticed something else. Inside the jacket lining, hidden in a seam that most people would never think to check, was a unit patch. Faded, carefully stitched. 75th Ranger Regiment. Her breathing changed. Just slightly. Just enough to remind her that some parts of the past don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig. The examination continued with practiced efficiency. For access, blood draws, chest X-ray, continuous cardiac monitoring. Hargrove supervised from the corner, present enough to maintain authority but distant enough to avoid the actual work. Hannah moved around the unconscious ranger like she'd been doing this work for longer than the 3 months Sacred Heart had been her employer. Because she had. And then the patient in the next bay, the one with the minor laceration, the one waiting for stitches, he went very still. His eyes were locked on Hannah's hands. When Hargrove left the area for a moment, moving to review lab results at the computer station, the older man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something barely audible, a whisper meant only for her. "You tied off bleeders in a Humvee outside Tikrit," he said. "I watched you save my squad leader while we were pinned down under fire. You're the medic from 3rd Battalion." Hannah's hands froze. The syringe she was preparing, 14-gauge needle for a potential transfusion, suspended an inch above the patient's arm. Her face drained of color the way a tide pulls away from shore, revealing everything that was supposed to stay submerged. "You're mistaken," she said, but her voice cracked. Actual tone breaking, the first crack in the composure that had held her together for 3 months of invisibility. "Gnome," the older man said quietly, with the certainty of someone who'd been there, who'd seen what she could do. "I never forget the hands that saved my brothers. I know what you are." The monitors were still beeping. The ranger in the adjacent bay was still crashing, his oxygen saturation beginning its slow decline, his heart rate accelerating as his body tried to compensate for whatever catastrophic failure was unfolding inside his chest. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn. Outside, a siren wailed toward them, then past them, then away. And Hannah stood frozen between her past, sitting in a hospital bed with a laceration, and her present, dying on a stretcher with a hidden military ring on his finger. Her carefully constructed anonymity fractured like glass under pressure. The helicopter sounds from outside suddenly seemed louder, closer, more real. The weight of 18 years pressed down against her shoulders, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Portland, she felt the burden of being seen. The ambulance doors burst open at 11:44 p.m., and the paramedics wheeled a stretcher through the automatic doors with the controlled urgency that meant vitals were deteriorating. No name on the intake paperwork. No identification. No wallet, no phone, nothing except clothes and a body that the ER had seen 1,000 times before, another John Doe, another mystery, another patient who would occupy a bed for exactly as long as insurance would cover. Hannah was 3 steps ahead of them before the stretcher cleared the threshold. Muscle memory. The kind that didn't ask permission. She caught the paramedic's eye, a woman with sergeant's posture, someone who understood hierarchy without discussion, and the briefing came in clipped, practice sentences. Unconscious on scene. Vitals were stable in the field. Last BP was 118/76. Now he's crashing. The monitor showed what the words couldn't, heart rate climbing. 94/103. 112, blood pressure sliding downward like a car losing traction on black ice. She moved with the stretcher, scanning the patient's exposed skin. Male, roughly 48 to 52 years old, weathered in the way that came from deployments and mountain climates and years of sleeping in vehicles. His left hand rested against his thigh, and Hannah saw it immediately, a military ring. The kind that didn't photograph well, didn't glimmer under fluorescent lights the way jewelry was supposed to. This one was dull, worn thin from decades of being twisted anxiously. A class ring, heavy gold, with a distinctive insignia that stopped Hannah's breath without changing her expression. She didn't miss a step. She didn't even slow down. She simply noted it the way a hunter notes fresh tracks. The jacket he'd arrived in had been cut away by paramedics and tossed onto the stretcher's lower shelf. Hannah caught it with one hand as they wheeled into Trauma Bay 3, and her fingers found the inside lining before anyone else was even looking. There. Sewn with what looked like thread from a field pack repair kit, faded nearly to invisibility, a unit patch. 75th Ranger Regiment. The letters were barely visible, but Hannah had worn that same patch on a uniform for 15 years, and she could have identified it in absolute darkness by touch alone. The room crystallized around her. Every other sound faded. The ventilator hiss became distant. The monitor beeps became rhythm instead of alarm. Her vision narrowed to the man on the stretcher and the reality of what his body was telling her. Get him on the monitor. 12 lead, Hannah said, and the resident moved without questioning. Residents never questioned nurses who sounded like that, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't raise it. The command was simply heavier than everything else in the room. Cardiac leads. Now. And I need a portable chest X-ray stat. She positioned herself at the patient's head, working his shirt away with the efficiency of someone who'd dressed wounds in vehicles that were moving too fast. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. She listened for something underneath the humming, something that every paramedic and resident in this room had missed because they weren't listening for it. Muffled heart sounds. The kind that came when something was pressing on the heart from the outside. Like listening to a drum from underneath water. She leaned closer, stethoscope moving across his chest in the pattern she'd learned from an army medic named Castellano who'd taught her field medicine in a desert that had stopped existing the day she left it. Distended neck veins. Subtle at this angle, but there. The pressure was building. The pressure was always building in cardiac tamponade, fluid accumulating around the heart until the heart couldn't fill, couldn't pump, couldn't do the one job it had been designed to do for decades. Blood pressure falling. 110/68. 105/62. 98/55. The descent was happening faster now. Beck's triad. All three components clicking into place like rounds chambering in a magazine. Muffled heart sounds. Distended neck veins. Dropping blood pressure. Textbook presentation. Textbook emergency. Page Dr. Hargrove stat, Hannah said to the resident. This patient needs an emergency pericardiocentesis. The resident's face did something uncertain. He was young enough that he still looked shocked by emergencies. I'll call him. But the patient just came in. Shouldn't we do imaging first? Rule out. Rule out what? Hannah's voice remained level. Clinical. The voice of someone who wasn't arguing, simply stating fact. This patient will be in cardiac arrest in 4 minutes if fluid isn't drained from around his heart. Maybe 5 if we're lucky. Imaging takes time. He doesn't have it. The page went out. 2 minutes passed like they were being lived in real time, each second audible in the monitor's accelerating beep. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped. 94%. 91%. The pressure continued its descent. 95/50. Dr. Hargrove arrived in the doorway with the kind of entrance that suggested he'd been sleeping somewhere comfortable and resented the interruption. His face was still creased from a pillow on one side. He hadn't bothered to button his white coat. He looked at the patient on the stretcher with the distant expression of someone examining a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned. What's the situation? His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to without question. Hannah delivered the assessment. Not a request. Not a plea. Simply information, delivered with the precision of someone who'd briefed command officers in actual combat zones. Unconscious male, approximately 50 years old. Vitals were stable on arrival. Now showing muffled heart sounds, distended neck veins, and dropping blood pressure. BP is currently 93/48 and falling. Heart rate 128. Patient is presenting with classic Beck's triad for cardiac tamponade. He requires emergency pericardiocentesis to relieve the pressure around the heart before he arrests. Hargrove stepped closer to the monitor, not to the patient. He studied the numbers the way a man studies a text he's already decided is wrong. You're a nurse, not a diagnostician, he said. His tone was the one Hannah had learned to recognize over the past 3 months, the same one he'd used before knocking her lunch tray to the floor. The one that didn't carry anger, just certainty. It's just hypertension. Could be hypovolemia. Could be sepsis. We'll get some labs, run the chest x-ray, and wait for cardiology to consult in the morning. The monitor beeped. 89/44. Cardiology will be 3 to 4 hours, Hannah said. Her voice didn't change. Didn't rise. But something in it changed anyway, something that made the resident step back half a step. In 3 hours, this patient will be dead. Beck's triad is a clinical diagnosis. It doesn't require cardiology. It requires someone to put a needle in the pericardium and drain the fluid that's crushing his heart. And I'm telling you to wait for the consultant, Hargrove said. He turned away from the monitor as if that would make the numbers stop falling. No emergency procedures without attending physician authorization. Those are the rules. Hannah's hands had curled into fists without her permission. She uncurled them, one finger at a time, the way she'd taught herself to do when the sound of helicopters made the walls feel like they were closing in. The ring on the unconscious ranger's finger caught the overhead light as the monitor beeped again. 85/40. I'm calling cardiology, Hannah said. You're not authorized to call anyone, Hargrove replied. He moved to the door. And if you exceed your scope of practice on this patient, we'll have a very different conversation about your employment status at Sacred Heart. He paused in the doorway, just long enough to add weight to his next words. Are we clear, Nurse Clarke? He left. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, already fading before Hannah had even moved. She stood at the patient's bedside, watching the numbers drop like a countdown to something inevitable. The resident was still standing there, uncertain. The other nurses had become very interested in their various tasks. Hannah reached for the phone. I'm not authorized, she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. Just a statement of fact delivered to no one. That's the rule. The patient's oxygen dropped to 88%. The pressure hit 80/38. She dialed cardiology. A sleepy voice answered on the third ring. Hannah gave the briefing, fast, clinical, leaving out every opinion and delivering only the physical findings. Muffled heart sounds. Distended neck veins. Dropping blood pressure. Beck's triad. Cardiac tamponade. Emergency pericardiocentesis required. The cardiologist was moving before she finished. I'm 6 minutes out. Do not wait for me. This patient needs that fluid drained now. Who's the attending? Dr. Hargrove, Hannah said. He's declined to authorize the procedure. There was a pause. The kind that meant the cardiologist understood the situation completely, the patient crashing, the attending refusing, and a nurse standing at the bedside with the knowledge but not the authority. I'm calling him, the cardiologist said. And I'm documenting that I ordered it. Hannah hung up the phone just as Hargrove appeared in the doorway again. He'd moved fast, which meant someone had called him. His face had gone very still. I told you not to make calls, he said. Cardiology consulted independently, Hannah replied. She didn't look at him. She was watching the monitor. 76/35. The patient's oxygen was 84% and falling. They're on their way. Hargrove walked directly to the nurse's station and began writing something on a form. His handwriting was sharp, angular, the penmanship of someone used to having documents followed without question. He taped it to the wall where every nurse on the shift would see it. Directive: Nurse Clarke is not to make independent medical decisions or contact specialists without explicit attending physician approval. All patient communication must be authorized by Dr. Hargrove prior to execution. Non-compliance will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. The words were formal. Institutional. Unarguable. Hannah watched the monitor. 72/32. The patient's skin was cooling. Mottling at the edges. The body knew what the mind didn't, that it was running out of time. The ring on his finger seemed to glow under the lights. The 75th Ranger Regiment. Someone's brother. Someone's father. Someone's soldier. She thought about her daughter at home. 12 years old. Finally stable. Finally happy in a way she hadn't been in the 2 years after her mother had left the Navy, PTSD haunting every room, every helicopter sound, every unexpected noise. The cardiologist burst through the trauma bay doors. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Right here," Hannah said. "What's his current pressure?" 70/30. Dropping. O2 sat at 82 and falling. The cardiologist didn't look at Hargrove. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the patient. She looked at Hannah, and in that look was everything, recognition of another person who understood that sometimes the rules existed for a reason other than following them. "We're going in," the cardiologist said. "Get me a 14-gauge needle, for tubing, and a drainage bag." Stat! Hannah was already moving. The crash cart squeaked like a wounded animal as Hannah pushed it toward the hallway. 90 seconds. That's how long it would take cardiology to arrive from the 4th floor, if they came at all. She knew the drill. She'd done the math in her head the moment the monitor alarmed. John Doe's pericardial sac was filling with blood. The pressure around his heart was climbing. In 90 seconds, he would be dead. She was already moving. The 14-gauge needle sat in its sterile package on the cart, alongside the drainage tubing and collection bag. Hannah's hands didn't shake as she prepped the field. 3 months of invisibility had made her good at moving without being noticed. But this wasn't invisibility anymore. This was defiance. Dr. Hargrove heard the cartwheels and appeared like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. His face hardened as he watched her position herself at John Doe's bedside, the crash cart angled for access to the patient's anterior chest wall. He strode across the linoleum with the kind of purposeful speed that made other staff step back. "Step away from that patient, Clarke." Hannah didn't look up. She was already prepping his skin with povidone iodine solution, the orange antiseptic spreading across the second intercostal space like a map of where the needle had to go. The smell of it, sharp, almost metallic, filled her senses. "I said step away." Hargrove's voice had dropped to the tone he used when he wanted to be heard without shouting. A voice like a guillotine blade coming down. "Cardiac tamponade," Hannah said quietly. "BP 68/40. He's losing consciousness. Cardiology is 90 seconds out. Which means you wait for cardiology. He'll arrest before they get here." Hargrove stepped directly between her and the patient, blocking her view. His height, 6'2", broad-shouldered, everything about him designed to take up space, became a wall. Around them, other nurses and residents began to pause, sensing the electricity building in the hallway. "You are not a cardiologist, Ms. Clarke. You are a nurse. A new nurse. And if you touch that patient without authorization—" "I'm calling security," he finished, his eyes never leaving hers. "This is your moment to make a choice. Step back now, and we move past this. You keep walking down this road, and your career at Sacred Heart ends today." The fluorescent lights above them buzzed, a sound like electricity trying to escape. Hannah's peripheral vision caught movement. A resident freezing mid-stride. A unit secretary leaning forward at her desk. The weight of an audience, building. Hannah looked at Hargrove's face. Really looked at it. She saw the confidence there, the absolute certainty that his rank, his position, his network of favors would protect him. She saw the man who'd thrown a chart at her feet. Who'd made a betting pool about her quitting. Who'd watched her absorb humiliation for 3 months without blinking. And she saw something else, she saw someone who'd never been told no by someone who meant it. "Then call them," Hannah said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Call them right now, doctor. I'll wait." She turned back to the patient. Not asking. Not deferring. Not performing the ritual of submission he expected. Hargrove's face went white. For a moment, maybe two, he didn't move. Then he pulled his phone from his coat pocket with the speed of drawing a weapon. Security to the ER hallway. Code 3. We have a nursing staff member acting without authorization on a patient in my care. Hannah cleaned the injection site with alcohol swab, her movement steady as surgical steel. Around them, the hallway had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that happens just before something breaks. She located the landmarks on his chest. The second intercostal space. The midclavicular line. The anatomical map she'd memorized in military medicine courses 15 years ago. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, the kind of precision that came from having done this in a Humvee outside Fallujah with the sound of small arms fire echoing off concrete. What you're doing is illegal, Hargrove said. He wasn't raising his voice anymore. He was documenting. Building his case in real time. You are practicing medicine without a license. You are overstepping your authority. You will be held liable for any complications that result from this unauthorized procedure. Hannah inserted the needle. The moment it entered his chest, the patient's entire body relaxed. His breathing deepened. The monitor that had been climbing, systolic pushing 90, then starting to drop, stabilized at 95. Then 98. Then 102. Fluid, Hannah said. Her voice carried the weight of command. A young resident, barely into his second year, moved forward with a collection bag and handed it to her. 60 cc of blood drained into the bag. Dark red, almost black. The blood that had been crushing John Doe's heart, suffocating it. The monitor steadied. O2 sat climbed, 88, 91, 94, 96. Sinus rhythm, that beautiful, steady beep 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 that meant a heart pumping correctly. The patient's eyes fluttered. His hand moved. He was coming back. Hannah secured the needle with tape and stepped back, her shoulders dropping slightly. The first full breath she'd taken in 2 minutes. Get him to ICU, she said to no one in particular. To everyone. Staff moved immediately, not because she was a nurse, but because in the space of 60 seconds, she'd become someone different. Someone whose orders landed with the weight of experience. Monitor continuous. ISTAT labs. Trauma surgery consult. Hargrove stood 3 feet away, his phone still in his hand. His face had moved past white into a kind of ashen color that made the lines around his mouth look like scars. You just violated every protocol in this hospital, he said quietly. Hannah looked at him. Really looked at him. For 3 months, she'd absorbed his contempt. Accepted his humiliation. Let him believe she was someone small, someone easily broken. But that was the mask. That was the woman he'd been hunting. The patient is alive, Hannah said. That's what happened here, doctor. Hargrove's jaw clenched. Around them, staff had begun to move again, nurses pursuing the stretcher, residents conferring, the machinery of crisis response grinding into motion. But Hannah saw something else in his face. She saw the moment he understood he'd been wrong about her. He'd misjudged her. And worse, witnesses had seen everything. It took Hargrove exactly 90 minutes to move to Plan B. By the time Hannah finished her shift notes, her phone had started vibrating. Once. Twice. 3 times. All incoming calls she'd miss because she was still clocked in, still documenting the procedure that had saved John Doe's life, still the invisible nurse pushing a mop through a hospital that would soon decide she'd never existed. She clocked out at 7:15 a.m. 42 minutes later, she was called to human resources. Hargrove had been efficient. She'd give him that. He'd called board members who owed him referrals, surgeons and cardiologists who'd built their practices on his patient recommendations. He'd contacted what he believed were her nursing school references, fishing for disciplinary records, learning problems, psychological issues. He'd brought in an outside investigator from the state nursing board, a woman in a grey suit who sat across from Hannah with a file that was already 2 inches thick. "Ms. Clarke," the woman began, "we've received complaints regarding your conduct at Sacred Heart Hospital. Specifically, performing a medical procedure, a pericardiocentesis, without physician authorization or appropriate licensure." Hannah sat without speaking. Her badge lay on the table between them like an indictment. "You understand this constitutes practicing medicine without a license," the investigator continued. "The patient would have died without the procedure," Hannah said. "That may be true. But it doesn't change the fact that you acted outside your scope of practice." The meeting lasted 37 minutes. By the end of it, Hannah's badge was deactivated. By the end of it, her locker, still mostly empty after 3 months, because she'd never brought much into this place, was emptied into a cardboard box by a hospital security officer who wouldn't meet her eyes. She carried the box to her car in the early morning light. The September sun was brutal after the night shift, casting everything in shades of bronze and gold. She set the box on the passenger seat. Inside it, a single photograph of her daughter, Sophia, age 12, taken at the beach 3 summers ago before everything got too quiet inside Hannah's head. By 9:45 a.m., she was home. By 10:19 a.m., Sophia came home from school because the school year hadn't officially started yet, just early registration and orientation. She found her mother at the kitchen table, still in scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and the particular exhaustion of a 12-hour night shift that had ended not with the normal return to sleep but with the kind of ending that doesn't have a name. "Mommy." Sophia's voice was small, uncertain. "Why are you home?" "It's only 10:30. Hannah couldn't find words. The mask had held for 3 months. It had held through Hargrove's mockery and humiliation. It had held while she performed an emergency procedure in a hallway, while she stood down a surgeon, while she saved a life. But it cracked now, in her kitchen, across from the only person who still needed her to be something other than invisible. "I did something right today," Hannah said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I saved someone's life. But it cost me my job, baby." And she couldn't finish. Sophia was across the table and into her mother's arms before Hannah could say anything else. Hannah held her daughter, pressed her face into the girl's hair, and let herself shake, but only where no one else could measure it. Only in the privacy of being broken in front of the one person who'd chosen to love her anyway. Outside the kitchen window, the September sun climbed higher. Somewhere in the city, Dr. Hargrove was working his phone, cementing his victory, believing he'd won. Somewhere else, an unconscious Army Ranger named John Doe was waking up in an ICU bed with tubes in his chest, alive because a woman in scrubs had chosen to disobey an order. Hannah held her daughter and whispered into the silence, "I did the right thing, baby. Sometimes that's not enough." But she was wrong. Sometimes, the right thing is exactly enough. Sometimes it just takes longer for the world to catch up. The investigator arrived at 2:08 p.m. on a Tuesday. His name was Douglas Pierce, and he moved through Sacred Heart's hallways with the casual confidence of a man who'd ended 100 careers before breakfast. Sharp suit. Sharper eyes. Dr. Hargrove had made the call that morning. Pierce's retainer was already paid, his marching orders crystal clear: build a case. Any case. Something that would stick to Hannah Clarke and leave marks. The chart he carried was a masterpiece of selective documentation. Procedure outside her scope. Unauthorized administration of medical intervention. Operating without physician supervision. Every line was technically defensible. Every line was a lie by omission. Pierce had spoken to 3 nurses already, 2 said nothing, 1 said she'd been following orders. That 1 would disappear from the staffing roster by Friday. Hargrove had already made the call. Hannah was in Bay 7 when security approached. She'd been methodically restocking the suture kit, each instrument placed with the same precision she'd used assembling rifle components in forward operating bases. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She'd been in worse rooms than this. "Ms. Clarke." The security chief's voice carried the rehearsed tone of someone following a script someone else had written. "We need you to come with us." She set down the forceps. Looked at him once. Nodded. The investigation interview lasted 43 minutes. Pierce sat across from her with a recorder running, asking questions he already knew the answers to, watching for the tremor in her voice, the crack in her composure. He got neither. Hannah answered every question with the economy of a trained witness. Yes, she'd performed the procedure. Yes, she'd done it without explicit physician authorization. Yes, she understood hospital protocol. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't cry. When Pierce asked if she understood the severity of the charges, Hannah met his eyes and said, "I do." That was all. The termination letter was waiting in HR, effective immediately. Practicing medicine without a license. Insubordination. Endangering hospital liability. The laminated badge felt heavier in her hands than it should have. 3 months of building a life that fit, 3 months of invisible competence, 3 months of being someone other than the person she'd been, reduced to a laminated rectangle and a cardboard box. Her locker emptied in 6 minutes. The off-brand coffee mug she'd bought at a corner store. The photograph of her daughter in a silver frame. 2 pairs of compression socks. A dog-eared copy of the Brothers Karamazov she'd been reading on breaks. Everything that had occupied the small metal space where she'd changed into scrubs and changed back out again, now stacked in a box that smelled like cardboard and finality. Security walked her to her car. Not escorted, that would have drawn questions. But present. Watching. Making sure she left. The parking lot was grey under Portland's perpetual cloud cover, rain threatening to materialize the way it always did, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the loading dock. Hannah set the box on the passenger seat. Sat in the driver's seat. Started the engine. She did not cry in the car. She drove home in the rain, wipers squeaking their metronome rhythm, and she did not cry. She parked in her driveway at 3:22 p.m., 2 hours and 38 minutes before her daughter came home from school. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold, and she let one tear slide down her cheek, just one, and wiped it away with the back of her hand before it could fall onto the table. Her daughter found her there at 5:24 p.m., still sitting, still in her scrubs. "Mommy." Sophie's backpack dropped by the door. 12 years old and already reading the spaces between things. "Why are you home?" Hannah looked at her daughter, really looked at her, the way you do when you're trying to memorize someone's face before deployment. Tried to find the words that would make sense of a world that had just decided she was dangerous for trying to save a life. "I'm home early," Hannah said. And that was all she could manage. Sophie set her lunch box on the counter, didn't ask again. Kids know when their parents are fractured. They sit with it quietly, the way they sit in waiting rooms. She made herself a snack and went upstairs, leaving Hannah at the table with her cold coffee and the weight of the box in the next room. The call came at 6:53 a.m. the following morning. Hannah was already awake. Sleep had become a complicated negotiation with her own nervous system years ago. The hospital administrator's voice came through the phone line like radio static, resolving into words: federal investigation. Classified documents. Pentagon. A SEAL team arriving by helicopter. Everything was happening at once and in absolute silence. That was when the other patient arrived. The hospital staff didn't recognize him at first. Middle-aged, exhausted, speaking Arabic to the paramedics in a voice that carried 40 years of war. A translator seeking asylum, admitted through emergency intake with acute appendicitis. Routine case. Surgical consultation. Standard protocol. He saw Hannah in the hallway outside the pre-op area. The scream that came out of him was primal. It shattered the careful morning air of Sacred Heart and brought every medical professional within earshot running toward the sound. "The woman who spared me. The American who gave me water. In Tikrit, she gave me water when soldiers said no." Hannah stood motionless. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum in their fixtures. The translator was sobbing now, pointing at her, words tumbling over each other in Arabic and broken English. You took off my blindfold. You saw I was just scared. You gave me water. You saved my life when I was your enemy. Hannah's daughter was in the administrative office by 7:15 a.m., taken there by social services, worried she was unsafe at home with a mother under investigation. The office was crowded now. Pentagon representatives, FBI agents, the hospital's legal team. The SEAL team leader had arrived by helicopter 42 minutes earlier, rotor wash still settling on the landing pad outside. Sophie stood in the corner in her school uniform, backpack still on her shoulders, and she looked directly at the assembled adults and said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "My mom is a senior chief petty officer." Silence. Hannah was reading the declassified file with trembling hands, and yes, they trembled now, trembled with the magnitude of what was being uncovered, the compartmentalized life she'd spent 3 months carefully boxing up now exploding into light. 2 tours in Iraq. Unit citation for extracting 43 civilians under fire from a collapsed building in the Jolan district. Medals. Commendations. A service record that read like something from a classified operation manual. Senior Chief Clarke, the SEAL team leader, said his name was Commander James Mercer, and he carried himself like a man who'd spent decades in spaces where hesitation meant death, earned a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts in Tikrit. She saved more lives than everyone in this room combined. The FBI agent opened a folder. We're also here about healthcare fraud. Extensive billing irregularities. Falsified patient records. Dr. Hargrove's office attempted to delete server logs at 11:08 p.m. last night. All of them. The young man who entered was late 20s, crew cut, Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm beneath his hospital IT uniform. Marcus Webb. He spoke with the precision of someone who'd spent years securing networks on military bases. "Sir, I'm former Marine Corps network security. When I saw the deletion attempt originating from Dr. Hargrove's office terminal, accessed with his password while security footage shows him physically present in that location, I immediately secured an external backup and reported it to federal authorities." Hargrove's lawyer attempted objections. The FBI agent produced a warrant. Dr. Hargrove was asked to step outside. In the hallway, he made his final play. He tried to claim Hannah's PTSD made her unstable, her military background proof of psychological instability, her silence in the face of his cruelty evidence of a fractured mind. The words came quickly, desperate, the voice of a man watching his insurance fraud evaporate into federal jurisdiction. Commander Mercer cut him off. "Doctor, Senior Chief Clarke has more medical training and combat experience than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. The only deception here is yours." The hospital attorney presented the evidence: fraudulent billing codes, altered patient records, kickback arrangements with a medical supply company worth $847,000 over 18 months. The lake house in Aspen. The luxury car. The boat with his name on the title. All of it funded by the systematic theft that Hannah's competence and attention to detail threatened to expose. Hargrove's face crumbled. That was the phrase that came to Hannah's mind when she saw it. Crumbled. Like something that had been holding its shape through sheer force of will suddenly gave up the effort. He was escorted out by FBI agents. As he passed Hannah in the hallway, she said nothing. Just wiped away a single tear and stood with the quiet dignity that came from having stood in worse places than hospital corridors, having survived worse than shame. The state medical board suspended his license that afternoon. The investigation continued through autumn, through the holidays, through winter. By March, his license was permanently revoked. The federal charges filed against him included healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of medical records. The lake house sold at auction. The car was repossessed. 3 months later, Hannah returned to Sacred Heart, not as a night shift nurse, but as head of the emergency department, personally recruited by a board that had nearly gotten a senior chief petty officer killed on the night shift. Sophie walked beside her, through the doors Hannah had entered as an invisible person and now re-entered as exactly who she was. The staff saluted subtly, the way military personnel do when acknowledging rank. The ranger, John Doe, now identified as Sergeant Marcus Clayton, decorated with 2 Purple Hearts of his own, visited her office on her first day back. He carried something wrapped in cloth. Unwrapped it carefully, a military ring, heavy gold, bearing the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. His father's ring. His father had been a ranger too. "You saved my life when someone else chose politics over duty," Marcus said. "Please keep it." Hannah threaded it onto a chain that already held her dog tags. Wore both openly now, the ring and the tags, the 2 pieces of identity that had nearly cost her everything, now hanging openly where everyone could see. Sophie watched her mother pin the senior chief petty officer insignia to her office wall. Asked the question that mattered, "Why did you hide it, Mom?" Hannah touched the ring and dog tags at her neck, feeling their weight, their realness, and answered carefully, "I needed to remember I was more than my worst days. But I also needed to remember who I was on my best ones." 6 months later, a text arrived on Hannah's phone, a photograph of Dr. Hargrove sitting at a folding table outside a grocery store in Gresham, selling health insurance policies. His expensive suit had been replaced by a cheap blazer. Hannah deleted the message without responding. She'd already moved forward. Mercy wasn't forgetting, it was refusing to look back. During a staff meeting, a young night shift nurse asked what leadership meant. Hannah touched the ring at her throat, felt the weight of metal and memory and 2 identities that were finally, at last, the same person. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," Hannah said. "When no one's watching, when there's no reward, when doing right costs you everything, that's when you find out who you really are." The helicopter sounds from the rooftop helipad no longer triggered panic in her chest. They triggered purpose. She stood in the emergency department, her emergency department now, and she was both invisible and unmistakable, both the careful nurse who'd made no waves and the senior chief petty officer who'd jumped into a hallway with nothing but conviction and muscle memory. The duality had become clarity. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to know. Heroes walk among us, sometimes pushing mobs, sometimes saving lives in the dark. And sometimes, they're both the same person. Like, comment, and let me know, what would you have done in Hannah's position?